Blood pounded in Ethan Hunt's ears as he stood frozen in the doorway of apartment 7B. His girlfriend of 3 years, Daisy Buchanan, naked and wrapped around their landlord, Richard Gere. The champagne he'd brought to celebrate their anniversary slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Jesus, Ethan. Daisy scrambled for the sheet, not quite covering herself. You're supposed to be at work. Richard didn't even bother moving. Well, this is awkward. His smirk said otherwise. I took the day off. Ethan's voice sounded hollow, distant. For our anniversary. Richard laughed. Anniversary? She's been coming to my place for months. Right after you leave for work. He traced a finger down Daisy's bare shoulder. Usually right after I slip another eviction notice under your door. The room tilted. 3 years of overtime, of supporting Daisy's art career, of scraping together rent for this overpriced dump while Richard threatened them with eviction notices. All while they were? How long? Ethan managed. Daisy rolled her eyes. Does it matter? You're so predictable, Ethan. So safe. Always buried in your blueprints. The architect who couldn't see what was right in front of him, Richard added, chuckling. Classic. Something shifted inside Ethan. Something cold and hard crystallizing where his heart had been. He'd given everything to this woman. To this life. His vision narrowed as he stepped back, his voice barely above a whisper. You won't see me again. Richard's laugh followed him down the hallway. Don't forget, rent's due Friday. Or you're both out. 3 hours later, Ethan sat alone in a hotel room, laptop open to his bank account. After paying for Daisy's art supplies, her portion of the rent, and the anniversary dinner reservations he'd just canceled, he had exactly $247 to his name. His phone buzzed with Daisy's 10th message. Asterisk, it didn't mean anything. Come home. Where will you go? Asterisk. Ethan stared at his reflection in the dark hotel window. At 27, he'd spent his promising architecture career supporting someone else's dreams while putting his own innovative designs aside. He'd made himself small, unthreatening, safe. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, opening a folder he hadn't touched in months. Urban Innovation Grant Application. The deadline was tomorrow. I will never be powerless again, he whispered to his reflection and began to type. Hello, beautiful people. Thanks so much for joining me for another story. Where are you watching from today? I hope you're doing well and settling in for this wild ride I've got planned. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, what are you waiting for? Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in Ethan's journey from betrayal to, well, you'll see. The Urban Innovation Grant Committee's office buzzed with nervous energy. Ethan shifted in his seat, surrounded by architectural powerhouses from across the country. His portfolio sat on his lap, not the safe, commercial designs he created for Baldwin and Associates, but his true passion, sustainable urban living spaces that transformed communities while preserving their soul. Mr. Hunt, a woman with steel-rimmed glasses appeared. The committee will see you now. Ethan entered a room where 5 distinguished architects sat behind a curved table. At the center was Dominic Cobb, the legendary innovator whose work had inspired Ethan since college. You're proposing the Nexus, Cobb said, flipping through Ethan's designs. Ambitious. Too ambitious, muttered another committee member. These integrated community spaces, the sustainability features, the cost alone. May I? Ethan stood, hands trembling slightly as he approached the digital display. For the next 15 minutes, he didn't think about Daisy or Richard or his empty bank account. He lost himself explaining his vision for buildings that healed broken communities. The problem with most urban renewal, Ethan concluded, is that it displaces the very people it claims to help. The Nexus solves that with tiered pricing models while still remaining profitable for investors. Silence fell across the room. Cobb leaned forward, removing his glasses. Why architecture, Mr. Hunt? The question caught Ethan off guard. I'm sorry. What drives you? What made you choose this field? Ethan considered the polished answer he usually gave about innovation and aesthetics. Instead, the truth spilled out. I grew up in foster care. 7 homes in 12 years. His voice steadied as he continued. The only constant was instability, never knowing if you belonged anywhere. I designed my first building at 14, a group home where kids could have privacy and community at the same time, where belonging wasn't conditional. He paused, then added, I believe spaces shape us as much as we shape them. After the presentation, Ethan found himself walking alongside Cobb toward the elevator. Your design has potential, Cobb said, but you're holding back. There's something cautious in your approach. Ethan swallowed. I've been told I play things safe. Safe doesn't change the world, Hunt. The elevator doors opened. Results in 3 weeks. Outside, the cool autumn air hit Ethan's face. His phone buzzed with a text from his best friend, Jack Dawson. Asterisk, how'd it go? Celebratory drinks. Asterisk. Ethan hesitated, then typed back. Need a place to crash for a few days? 20 minutes later, Ethan sat in Jack's cramped living room, a beer in hand, explaining everything. She was sleeping with Richard? That snake who's been threatening to evict you. Jack paced, furious. And now you're homeless? I'm not going back there, Ethan said quietly. I can't. Stay as long as you need. Jack dropped onto the couch beside him. But what about your stuff? Ethan shrugged. Just clothes and my equipment. Nothing I can't replace. And the grant? Long shot. Hundreds apply every year. Jack studied his friend. I've known you since freshman year. You've always put everyone else first, especially Daisy. Maybe it's time you put yourself first. Ethan's phone lit up with another message from Daisy. Asterisk, please come home. We need to talk. Richard was a mistake. Asterisk. With a decisive motion, Ethan blocked her number. I'm done being the reliable doormat everyone walks over, he said, something cold settling in his chest. If I get this grant. When you get this grant, Jack corrected. Asterisk, when asterisk I get this grant, Ethan conceded with the first genuine smile in days. Everything changes. Over the next 3 weeks, Ethan threw himself into work at Baldwin and Associates by day, and at night, refined his Nexus proposal, adding elements he'd been too cautious to include before. He also began searching for apartments, shocked at how the market had skyrocketed. No wonder Richard could leverage his position as landlord. People were desperate for housing. You should see the profits these slumlords make, Jack said one evening, hunched over his laptop. As an investigative financial journalist, he had access to public records most people ignored. Your ex's boyfriend owns 6 buildings, all operating with multiple code violations. The city fines him, he pays, and nothing changes. How does he get away with it? Money talks. City inspectors are overworked. Tenants have nowhere else to go. Jack spun his laptop around. Check this out. Richard's company, Apex Holdings, is actually part of a larger entity, Stellar Property Group. Never heard of them. They operate under dozens of LLCs, hard to trace. But they're buying up entire neighborhoods, driving up rent, forcing out long-term residents. Jack looked up. It's systematic. Something sparked in Ethan's mind, but before he could pursue it, his phone rang with an unknown number. Is this Ethan Hunt? A woman's voice asked. Speaking. This is Mallory Miles from the Urban Innovation Grant Committee. Mr. Cobb would like to meet with you tomorrow morning. After the call, Jack raised an eyebrow. Well, they want to meet. Ethan tried to temper his hope. Probably to let me down in person. The next morning, Ethan sat across from Dominic Cobb in a sleek office overlooking the city. We've reviewed all submissions, Cobb began, his expression unreadable. Yours stood out, but not initially for the right reasons. Ethan's heart sank. Your first submission was competent but cautious. Then you sent updated plans 2 weeks ago that were. Cobb paused, searching for the word, transformative. What changed? Ethan considered lying, then decided against it. My life fell apart. I stopped being afraid of failure. Cobb nodded slowly, then slid a folder across the desk. Congratulations, Mr. Hunt. The Urban Innovation Grant this year is $2.5 million. Ethan stared, speechless. Additionally, Cobb continued, I've shared your proposal with some private investors who are very interested. The Nexus could be the first of many projects, with potential backing of up to $50 million. The room seemed to tilt. $50 million? Your design solves problems developers have been wrestling with for decades. The right backing could turn this into a movement, not just a building. Cobb stood, extending his hand. The question is, are you ready to think bigger than one project? Walking out of the building, Ethan felt as though he were floating. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, it's Daisy. Had to use new phone. Please talk to me. Richard is selling the building. We're all being evicted. I have nowhere to go. Asterisk. Ethan stared at the message, a plan beginning to form. He called Jack. I got it, he said without preamble. The grant, the investors, everything. I never doubted you. Jack's excitement burst through the phone. We're celebrating tonight. First, I need your help. What was the name of that property group that owns Richard's buildings? Stellar. Why? Find out everything you can about them, especially if they're in financial trouble. There was a pause. Ethan, what are you thinking? Ethan watched as people hurried past on the street below, each locked in their own private struggles for security, for home. I'm thinking it's time I became the landlord. 6 weeks after receiving the grant, Ethan sat in the boardroom of Stellar Property Group, surrounded by his new team. Jack, who had taken leave from his journalism job to help. Ariadne Fisher, a brilliant young architect he'd hired from his former firm. And Thomas Anderson, a razor-sharp attorney specializing in real estate. Across the table sat Maxwell Shelby, CEO of Stellar, flanked by his legal team. The man's face had grown increasingly pale as Thomas outlined the terms of their offer. Let me be clear, Maxwell said, straightening his tie. You want to purchase our entire portfolio of residential properties in the Westridge district? 7 buildings, 342 units. That's correct, Ethan replied calmly. You're aware that's $47 million in property? We're offering $38 million, considering the outstanding code violations and the class action lawsuit being prepared against your company. Ethan nodded toward Jack, who slid a thick folder across the table. We have documentation. Maxwell's attorney whispered urgently in his ear. This is highly irregular, Maxwell finally said. Who exactly is backing Nexus Development? You appeared out of nowhere. We have the Urban Innovation Grant and a consortium of private investors committed to ethical urban renewal. Ethan leaned forward. But more importantly, we have evidence that Stellar has been systematically violating tenant rights laws, falsifying inspection reports, and engaging in predatory rental practices. Jack added, as a journalist, I'd find these documents fascinating reading for a series on housing corruption. The threat hung in the air. Maxwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. You've certainly done your homework, Mr. Hunt. But why these specific properties? There are plenty of distressed buildings in this city. Ethan kept his expression neutral, though his heart hammered. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. The reason he'd worked 20-hour days for weeks, leveraging every connection Cobb had offered. These buildings fit our development model, he said simply. After 2 hours of tense negotiation, Maxwell reluctantly agreed to the sale, pending board approval. Outside, Jack clapped Ethan on the shoulder. That was masterful. Did you see his face? Ariadne looked less certain. They'll investigate us thoroughly before finalizing. Let them, Thomas said, checking his watch. Our financing is legitimate, our plans are sound. The only question they might have is why we want these specific properties, which they'll attribute to their location near the university and downtown, Ethan finished. Perfect for our Nexus concept. Jack pulled Ethan aside as the others headed toward their cars. You never told them that one of those buildings is where Daisy lives. It wasn't relevant to the negotiation. So what happens when you own her building? What's the endgame here, Ethan? Ethan watched as Thomas and Ariadne drove away. Justice. The following week crawled by as they waited for Stellar's board decision. Ethan threw himself into planning, working with Ariadne to develop phased renovation approaches that wouldn't displace current tenants. Most developers clear buildings before renovating, she pointed out one evening, surrounded by blueprints in their temporary office. It's faster, cheaper. And destroys communities, Ethan countered. We're proving another model works. His phone rang, Thomas. They've accepted, the attorney said without preamble. The board approved the sale this morning. We sign papers next week. A weight Ethan hadn't realized he was carrying lifted from his shoulders. Any conditions? Just one. Stellar wants to handle tenant notification themselves. They don't want panic before the deal closes. After hanging up, Ethan stared out at the city lights. Soon, he would control the building where Daisy and Richard lived. The building from which they'd humiliated him, where they'd thought themselves untouchable. The next day, Ethan took a risk and drove past his old apartment building. He parked across the street, watching as residents came and went. Then he saw her, Daisy looking frazzled, arguing with someone on her phone as she hurried inside. His stomach clenched. Even after everything, seeing her still hurt. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, I know you're avoiding me, but please, Ethan. Richard is selling the building to some corporate developer. Everyone's panicking. You're the only person who might help me figure out what to do. Asterisk. He deleted the message without responding. The day of the closing, Ethan sat with Thomas in a conference room at First National Bank, signing document after document. Maxwell Shelby remained coolly professional, though his jaw tightened when Ethan signed the final paper. Congratulations, Mr. Hunt. You're now responsible for housing over 800 people. Maxwell gathered his papers. I hope you're prepared for what that entails. I understand responsibility very well, Mr. Shelby. As Maxwell turned to leave, Ethan added, by the way, when will tenants be notified of the ownership change? Letters went out this morning. Management offices will display the Nexus Development name starting tomorrow. Maxwell paused at the door. Good luck. You'll need it. The moment the door closed, Thomas raised an eyebrow. You didn't tell me the notifier was all that was standing between you and your ex. 48 hours, Ethan said, ignoring the comment. We need to move fast. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the management office of the West Park Apartments, his old building, watching as the Stellar Property sign came down and a temporary Nexus Development banner went up. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn, Jack warning him not to do anything rash, Ariadne with questions about immediate repairs, and 3 new messages from Daisy, increasingly desperate. Asterisk, who is Nexus Development? Are they going to evict everyone? Asterisk. Asterisk, Richard is freaking out. Says his boss sold the buildings without telling the managers. Asterisk. Asterisk, please, Ethan. I have nowhere to go if they evict me. Just talk to me, asterisk. He silenced his phone as the building manager, a thin woman named Tricia he'd barely spoken to during his tenancy, unlocked the office door. She nearly dropped her keys when she saw him. Can I help you? I'm Ethan Hunt, CEO of Nexus Development. He extended his hand. Your new employer. Her eyes widened with recognition. You used to live in 7B. Yes. And now I own the building. Color drained from her face. Mr. Gear doesn't know, does he? Not yet. Something in his tone made her straighten. What do you need me to do? For now, nothing changes. Continue operations as normal. I'm implementing a new resident assistance program, but we'll announce that next week. He handed her a business card. Call this number if Richard Gear attempts to access any financial records or tries to alter any tenant agreements. As he turned to leave, she called after him. Are you going to fire him? Ethan smiled thinly. That would be too simple. By noon, Ethan had visited all 7 buildings, introduced himself to the management staff, and established his authority. None of the other managers recognized him, and he preferred it that way. As he finished his final inspection, his phone rang with a call from the West Park building manager. Mr. Hunt? Richard just came in demanding access to the rent deposit accounts. Says he needs to make an emergency withdrawal. Ethan's grip tightened on his phone. Tell him all accounts have been frozen pending audit by the new ownership. He needs to contact the main office. He's not taking it well. I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, Ethan walked into the West Park management office to find Richard red-faced, shouting at Tricia. I don't care what the new owner said. I'm still the building manager until I'm told otherwise. Actually, Ethan said from the doorway, you're not. Richard turned, his angry retort dying on his lips as recognition dawned. You. Me. Ethan stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the counter. Richard Gear, your employment with Nexus Development is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings from the office. Richard's shock gave way to a sneer. This is about Daisy? You bought an entire building for revenge. 7 buildings, actually. Ethan removed a document from his briefcase. And this isn't about Daisy. It's about your illegal fee structures, your maintenance negligence, and your habit of threatening tenants with eviction to extort additional payments. Richard paled. You can't prove. I have signed statements from 12 tenants, bank records showing unofficial processing fees, and maintenance requests that were marked completed but never addressed. Ethan nodded to two security guards who had appeared in the doorway. The police may be interested as well. As security led a protesting Richard away, Tricia looked at Ethan with newfound respect. "What happens now?" "Now," Ethan said, "we fix what's broken." 3 months into Nexus Development's ownership of the Westridge properties, the changes were impossible to ignore. Security doors that had been broken for years now worked. Hallways smelled of fresh paint instead of mildew. A tenant assistance office had opened in each building, helping residents access services and address concerns. Richard had been replaced by a property management team that reported directly to Ethan. The special arrangements some tenants had made with Richard, payments off the books, ignoring occupancy limits, looking the other way for illegal activities, were systematically dismantled. Not everyone was happy. "You've got another complaint from 7B, Jack said, dropping a file on Ethan's desk in their newly established headquarters. "Third one this month." Ethan didn't need to open the file. "Let me guess. The rent increase. She claims it's retaliatory. Says the new owner must have a personal vendetta. All units of that size had the same adjustment. The difference is she's no longer getting preferential treatment." Ethan turned back to his computer. Standard response. Jack didn't move. "You know she's going to figure it out eventually." "Figure what out?" "That her ex-boyfriend is her landlord. That the man implementing all these changes, the man whose policies are making her life increasingly difficult, is you." Ethan's expression remained neutral. "Nexus Development owns those buildings. I'm merely the CEO, who just happens to be focusing intensely on the building where his ex lives." Jack sighed. "Look, I get why you started this. Richard was corrupt. The buildings needed someone to care. But this obsession with remaining anonymous to Daisy while systematically dismantling her life." "I'm not dismantling her life," Ethan cut in. "I'm running a business ethically. You're hiding behind corporate policy to punish her. Enforcing leases isn't punishment, Jack." "Then why not just tell her? Why the secrecy?" Before Ethan could answer, Ariadne knocked on his open door. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation at West Park. A group of tenants is in the lobby demanding to speak with management about the new community space renovations." "What's the issue?" Ethan asked, grateful for the interruption. "They're upset about losing the storage units on the first floor. They've organized a petition." Ethan grabbed his jacket. "I'll handle it." At West Park, about 20 residents had gathered in the lobby, led by an elderly woman Ethan recognized as Mrs. Chun from the second floor. "Mr. Hunt," she said firmly when he approached, "we want to keep our storage spaces. Some of us have used them for decades." Ethan listened as residents explained how the storage units, though small, were essential for people living in compact apartments. Many were immigrants who kept family heirlooms there. Others used them for seasonal items they couldn't fit in their units. "The community space in your plans looks beautiful," Mrs. Chin continued. "But we don't need another glossy room for show. We need practical spaces for living." Ethan studied the faces around him. People whose lives were directly impacted by his decisions, people who had been ignored by previous management. "You're right," he said finally. "We'll revise the plans." Relief washed over the group. Mrs. Chin smiled. "You actually listen. The last owner wouldn't even take our calls." As the group dispersed, Ethan noticed a familiar figure watching from the edge of the lobby, Daisy, observing the exchange with undisguised curiosity. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, his heart racing despite himself. That evening, Ethan and Ariadne reworked the renovation plans, incorporating resident feedback. "This is why your designs are special," she said, watching him sketch. "You actually care how spaces affect people." "I care about creating communities that work," he corrected, though her praise warmed him. As they worked, Ethan's phone buzzed with another message from Daisy. "Asterisk, I saw you today. You're behind Nexus Development? Why didn't you tell me? We need to talk, asterisk." Ariadne noticed his expression. "Problem? Nothing important." He silenced his phone again. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office to find Thomas waiting with concerning news. Richard Gere has filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against Nexus. He's claiming the company targeted him personally and that the CEO has a vendetta against him. Ethan remained calm. His employment was at will. We documented his violations. The case has no merit. Legally, you're right, Thomas agreed. But he's demanding documentation of all financial transactions since the takeover, tenant communications, everything. If a judge grants discovery, your personal connection to this property could complicate matters. I disclosed my prior tenancy to our investors. There's nothing improper about the purchase. The purchase, no. But your continued anonymity with certain tenants while making decisions that affect them could be interpreted as unusual. Ethan stared out his office window toward West Park Apartments, visible in the distance. Handle it, Thomas. That's what I pay you for. Later that day, Ethan conducted a walkthrough of West Park's upcoming renovations with the contractor. As they discussed electrical upgrades in the lobby, the elevator doors opened, and Daisy stepped out. She froze when she saw him, then marched directly over. So it's true. You're the mysterious new owner everyone's talking about. Her voice carried across the lobby, drawing attention from residents passing through. You bought our building and didn't even tell me? The contractor looked between them, confused. Ms. Buchanan, if you have concerns about your tenancy, please make an appointment with the management office, Ethan said formally. Don't give me that corporate bullshit, Ethan. She lowered her voice. You're doing this to get back at me. Not everything is about you. He turned to the contractor. Let's continue this upstairs. As they walked away, Daisy called after him. Richard is suing you, you know? He says you set this whole thing up for revenge. Ethan kept walking, though every muscle in his body tensed. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan drove to West Park and used his master key to access the roof, a space he'd often escaped to during his tenancy. The city spread before him, a tapestry of lights and shadows. I thought I might find you here. Ethan turned to find Jack emerging from the stairwell. Building manager called me when the security system showed the roof access opening. Figured it was you. Jack joined him at the railing. Heard about your run-in with Daisy today. News travels fast. Small buildings, big drama. Jack studied his friend's profile. You okay? Ethan shrugged. Why wouldn't I be? Because you've spent months orchestrating this elaborate scenario where you control her living situation without her knowing, and now she knows. This was never about her. Wasn't it? At least partly. When Ethan didn't answer, Jack pressed on. Look, I'm not saying she doesn't deserve consequences. What she did was awful. But this, buying buildings, firing Richard, changing policies, it's become your entire life. It's a business, Jack. A successful one. It started as revenge. It started that way, Ethan conceded. But it's become something more. These buildings, these communities, they matter. The work matters. And Daisy, Ethan's jaw tightened. Just another tenant, who you're still avoiding dealing with directly. Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang. Ariadne. We have a problem, she said without preamble. There's a leak in the main water line at Parkview Apartments. The basement is flooding, and it's threatening the electrical system. Ethan straightened. I'm on my way. The water main emergency kept Ethan occupied for the next 48 hours, coordinating emergency services, ensuring displaced tenants had temporary housing, and addressing the resulting insurance claims. By the time he returned to his office, exhausted but satisfied with the response, he had almost forgotten about his confrontation with Daisy. Almost. A stack of messages waited on his desk. Among them, a hand-delivered note. Asterisk Ethan, I understand why you're angry. What I did was unforgivable. But this cold corporate routine isn't you. The man I knew for 3 years cared about people. Meet me for coffee. Just talk to me. Daisy asterisk. He crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash just as Jack entered. The Parkview tenants are singing your praises, his friend announced. Apparently, no landlord in the history of the city has ever responded to an emergency so efficiently. It's basic decency. It's exceptional management, and you know it. Jack dropped into the chair across from Ethan's desk. Which makes me wonder why you're being so deliberately obtuse about one particular tenant. Drop it, Jack. She's been trying to reach you for days. I'm busy. Jack leaned forward. You can't avoid her forever. Either evict her or talk to her. But this limbo you're keeping her in. The West Park Annual Community Gala is in 2 weeks, Ethan interrupted. I'll be formally introduced to all tenants as the CEO of Nexus then. She can wait until then like everyone else. The gala you've turned into a black tie affair? The one you've invited city officials and the press to? That's how you want this confrontation to happen. It's not a confrontation. It's a community event. Ethan turned to his computer, signaling the end of the conversation. Now, if you don't mind, I have a company to run. After Jack left, Ethan sat staring at his screen, not really seeing it. The community gala had been his idea, a chance to formally introduce Nexus Development's vision to the residents and the broader community. He had invited business leaders, city officials, and press to showcase the company's innovative approach to urban housing. He told himself it was a business decision, a publicity opportunity. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered the truth. He wanted Daisy to see what he had become, what she had thrown away. He wanted her to realize that the man she had dismissed as safe and predictable now controlled her future. The thought should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it left a hollow feeling in his chest. The next week passed in a blur of preparations. Ethan avoided West Park during daytime hours, conducting necessary business by phone or through staff. He told himself it was efficiency, not avoidance. Then, 3 days before the gala, Thomas arrived with troubling news. Richard's attorney has submitted a motion for an emergency injunction to prevent the gala from proceeding. On what grounds? Ethan demanded. He's claiming it's an attempt to publicly humiliate him and damage his professional reputation. He's also amended his lawsuit to name you personally, not just Nexus Development. That's absurd. It gets worse. Thomas hesitated. He's named Daisy Buchanan as a co-plaintiff. Ethan went very still. What? She's claiming emotional distress and harassment through selective enforcement of building policies. Says you've been targeting her specifically while hiding behind corporate structure. For the first time since this all began, Ethan felt a flicker of doubt. Was Jack right? Had he crossed a line between justice and vengeance? Can they stop the gala? He asked finally. Unlikely. The judge assigned to the case is business-friendly. But this changes things, Ethan. Once you're named personally in a lawsuit, every communication with either plaintiff becomes legal evidence. Meaning no more notes, no more lobby confrontations, no personal interactions at all. Everything goes through legal channels now. Ethan nodded slowly, a strange relief washing over him. The decision had been made for him. What about the tenant files Jack uncovered? The ones showing Richard's illegal activities. Thomas smiled thinly. I was hoping you'd ask. We're filing a countersuit tomorrow morning with evidence of Richard's mismanagement, along with tenant statements. We're also seeking sanctions against their attorney for filing a frivolous claim. As Thomas outlined their legal strategy, Ethan found his thoughts drifting to Daisy. Had she really joined forces with Richard again? After everything he'd done to her? After everything they'd done to him? We should proceed with the gala as planned, Ethan decided. But I want extra security, and I want Daisy Buchanan and Richard Gere barred from the event. Thomas frowned. That could appear retaliatory. They're suing us, Thomas. Their presence would be disruptive. I'll have security at all entrances with their photos. After Thomas left, Ethan sat alone in his office, the city lights coming on as dusk settled. His phone buzzed with a text from Ariadne. Asterisk final designs for the community spaces approved. Tenants love the storage solution we developed. You were right, listening to them made the design better. Asterisk. A small smile touched his lips. Whatever his initial motivation, the work they were doing mattered. The buildings were improving. People's lives were better. Yet as night fell, he couldn't shake the uneasiness settling over him. The gala was supposed to be his moment of triumph. The moment when everyone would see what he had accomplished, what he was capable of. Instead, it felt increasingly like a confrontation he wasn't sure he wanted. The night of the West Park Community Gala arrived with all the grandeur Ethan had envisioned. The building's lobby and newly renovated community space had been transformed with elegant lighting, floral arrangements, and catering stations. A string quartet played in the corner as residents in their finest attire mingled with city officials, business leaders, and press. Ethan stood near the entrance, greeting guests alongside Ariadne and Thomas. He'd chosen a tailored charcoal suit that made him look every inch the successful CEO, worlds away from the struggling architect who had once lived in Unit 7B. The mayor just arrived, Thomas murmured. And the urban development commissioner. Ethan nodded, scanning the growing crowd. No sign of Richard or Daisy, though he'd stationed security at all entrances with strict instructions. Dominic Cobb approached, champagne in hand. Impressive transformation, Hunt. Hard to believe these are the same buildings Stellar nearly ran into the ground. We're just getting started, Ethan replied. The real renovations begin next month. Your investors are pleased. Very pleased. Cobb gestured toward a group of well-dressed men and women across the room. They're talking about additional funding for other neighborhoods. Pride swelled in Ethan's chest. This was what success felt like: respect, recognition, power. Everything he'd been denied before. As the evening progressed, Ethan moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and discussing Nexus Development's vision with influential guests. Several reporters requested interviews about the company's innovative approach to urban renewal. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator announced at 8 o'clock, please take your seats for dinner and the presentation. Ethan took his place at the head table as guests settled into their seats. The room hummed with anticipation as the lights dimmed slightly and a large screen descended from the ceiling. Good evening, Ethan began, standing to address the room. Welcome to the first annual West Park Community Gala. He scanned the audience, residents from all 7 properties, community leaders, investors, all watching him with interest and respect. This was his moment. 1 year ago, Nexus Development was just an idea, a vision for housing that serves communities instead of exploiting them. He gestured toward the screen as it displayed before and after images of the properties. Today, I'm proud to announce our next phase, the Nexus Initiative. The screen shifted to architectural renderings of the transformed buildings. Rooftop gardens, solar panels, modernized units, expanded community spaces. Over the next 18 months, we'll invest $22 million in renovations across all 7 properties, creating spaces that foster connection, sustainability, and growth, all without displacing a single resident. Applause rippled through the room. Ethan allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. But tonight isn't just about buildings. It's about people. He gestured toward the residents. The strength of any community lies in its members, which is why I'm especially proud to announce the Westridge Resident Equity Program. Thomas and Ariadne exchanged surprised glances. This wasn't in the script they'd prepared. Under this program, long-term residents will have the opportunity to purchase equity shares in their buildings at subsidized rates. Within 5 years, our goal is for residents to own 40% of each property. The room erupted in astonished murmurs. Several investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Because true security, Ethan continued, his voice carrying over the buzz, doesn't come from a landlord's goodwill. It comes from ownership. As applause filled the room, the doors at the back burst open. Security guards struggled to hold back a man forcing his way in. Richard Gere, red-faced and disheveled. "This is all lies," he shouted, breaking free and striding down the center aisle. "This man is a fraud." The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward the disruption. Ethan remained calmly at the podium. "Mr. Gere, you weren't invited to this event. Please leave before I have security escort you out. You want to know who Ethan Hunt really is?" Richard addressed the crowd, pointing accusingly. He didn't buy these buildings because he cares about communities. He bought them for revenge. Because I slept with his girlfriend. Shocked gasps rippled through the audience. The mayor raised an eyebrow. Investors whispered to one another. "Is that what this is about, Ethan?" A voice called from the side entrance. Daisy stood there, elegant in a black dress, her expression unreadable. "Punishing me through real estate?" Security moved toward her, but Ethan raised a hand, stopping them. The room had gone deathly quiet, hundreds of eyes moving between the 3 of them like spectators at a tennis match. "Ms. Buchanan," Ethan said evenly, "you also weren't invited." "I live here," she countered, walking slowly forward. "Or are you evicting me tonight, too?" Thomas rose from his seat, legal instincts kicking in. "As counsel for Nexus Development, I advise against this public confrontation during pending litigation." "No," Ethan said quietly. "Let them speak." Richard took the opening. "Tell them, Hunt. Tell everyone how you used your grant money to buy the building where your ex lived. How you've been targeting us with inspections and rent increases." "Is that true?" the Urban Development Commissioner asked, frowning. Ethan surveyed the room, the confused residents, the concerned officials, the calculating investors. The narrative he'd carefully constructed was unraveling. Yes, he admitted finally. I did once live in this building. I was a tenant here when I applied for the Urban Innovation Grant. He stepped away from the podium, addressing the room more intimately. What Mr. Gear isn't telling you is that during his time as building manager, he exploited tenants, ignored maintenance issues, and threatened people with eviction if they didn't pay unofficial fees. He gestured toward Jack, who had moved to stand beside a computer at the side of the room. We have documentation. The screen behind Ethan changed to display financial records, maintenance logs, and tenant complaints, all organized in damning clarity. Richard Gear and the previous owners of these buildings treated residents as cash machines, not people. Ethan's voice hardened. So yes, I had personal knowledge of these practices when I decided to purchase the properties. And yes, I took satisfaction in replacing corrupt management with ethical practices. He turned directly to Richard. But this was never about you. Or Ms. Buchanan. Richard sneered. You expect anyone to believe. Actually, Mrs. Chin interrupted, rising from her seat, I believe him. The elderly woman faced the room. I've lived in West Park for 27 years. Under the old management, my ceiling leaked for 3 years. 3 years. Mr. Hunt fixed it in 3 days. Another resident stood. They raised my rent illegally every 6 months. When I complained, they threatened eviction. More residents rose, sharing stories of Richard's negligence and exploitation. As the testimonials continued, Richard's face paled. You set this up, he hissed at Ethan. You turned them against me. You did that yourself, Ethan replied quietly. Richard lunged forward suddenly, grabbing a wine glass from a nearby table and hurling it at Ethan. It missed, shattering against the wall behind him as security finally restrained Richard. This isn't over, Hunt, he shouted as they dragged him toward the exit. I'll ruin you. The room buzzed with shocked conversations as Richard was removed. Ethan turned to find Daisy still standing there, watching him with an unreadable expression. May I speak with you privately? She asked quietly. Against Thomas's visible disapproval, Ethan nodded and led her to a small office off the main room. The moment the door closed, Daisy turned to him. Was any of it real? Us? The question caught him off guard. What? Were you always planning this? Using me to get to Richard, to the buildings? I didn't even know Richard owned the building when we met, Ethan said, confused. You can't possibly think. I don't know what to think anymore, she interrupted. First you disappear without a word. Then you secretly buy my building. Now I find out you're turning it into some kind of community ownership experiment. The resident equity program has nothing to do with you. Doesn't it? Because it feels like everything you've done has been calculated to either punish or impress me. Ethan stared at her, genuinely baffled. You think I orchestrated all of this, winning a national grant, securing $50 million in investment, developing an innovative housing model, to impress you? I think you did it to show me what I threw away, she said quietly. And it worked. You've made your point. Before he could respond, the door opened and Jack appeared, his expression grave. Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this. Now, Ethan followed Jack back to the main room, where guests clustered around phones and tablets, murmuring in concern. The celebratory atmosphere had evaporated. What's happening? Ethan asked. Jack handed him a tablet displaying a local news website. The headline made his blood run cold. Exclusive. Nexus CEO's vendetta. Leaked emails reveal personal revenge behind property purchase. Below the headline was a photograph of Ethan, and beneath that, screenshots of email exchanges between him and Jack from the early days of the project. Asterisk, I want to own the building where my ex lives. I want her to know I control her future. Asterisk. Asterisk, this isn't just business for me. This is justice. Asterisk. Asterisk, Richard and Daisy deserve everything coming to them. Asterisk. Ethan looked up, meeting the eyes of investors, officials, and residents, all watching him with new wariness. These are taken completely out of context, he said, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. Dominic Cobb approached, his expression grave. I think we need to discuss the future of our partnership, Hunt. One by one, the investors and officials made excuses and left. Residents returned to their apartments, the celebration forgotten. The catering staff began quietly clearing away untouched food. Within an hour, the gala that was supposed to be Ethan's triumph had emptied, leaving him standing alone in the decorated room with Jack, Ariadne, and Thomas. "The emails are real," Jack said finally. "From when we first discussed buying the buildings." "Who leaked them?" Ethan demanded. "Richard, obviously," Thomas replied. "But how he got access?" "My accounts were hacked 2 weeks ago," Jack admitted. "I changed all my passwords, but they must have already downloaded everything." Ethan loosened his tie, suddenly finding it hard to breathe. "How bad is this?" "Legally, you've done nothing wrong," Thomas said. "The purchase was legitimate. Your management has been exemplary." "But the optics are terrible," Ariadne finished. "The urban innovation darling exposed as seeking personal revenge." "We need damage control," Jack began, but Ethan cut him off. "No. No more spin. No more hidden agendas." He looked around the room, at the displays showing the Nexus Initiative, the pamphlets explaining the resident equity program, the abandoned celebration of something that had started as revenge but had become so much more. "The work speaks for itself," he said finally. "Either it's good enough to stand on its own, or it isn't." As they left the building, Ethan noticed Daisy waiting near the entrance. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, climbing into his car alone. Back in his apartment, Ethan stared at his phone as messages flooded in. Concerned investors, inquiring reporters, supportive friends. He ignored them all, pouring himself a whiskey and walking to the window. The city sprawled before him, lights glittering against the darkness. Somewhere out there was the life he'd imagined for himself. Respected architect, community builder, someone who mattered. Instead, he'd become exactly what he despised. Someone who used power over others to satisfy his own needs. His phone rang again, Cobb. "Hunt," the older man said without preamble. "The investor consortium is meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss the future of Nexus funding." "I understand. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you've jeopardized $50 million and the future of 7 communities over a personal grudge." "It didn't start that way." "But it did start that way," Cobb countered. "The question is whether it ended that way." After hanging up, Ethan sat in the darkness of his apartment, the weight of his choices settling over him. He had achieved everything he'd wanted: power, recognition, control. So why did it feel so hollow? The investor meeting was worse than Ethan had anticipated. Seated at the head of the conference table in Nexus Development's offices, he faced 12 grim-faced investors and Dominic Cobb, all clearly there to deliver a verdict rather than engage in discussion. "The board has concerns," the lead investor, Eleanor Rigby, began without preamble. "Serious concerns about your judgment and the motivations behind this project." "The motivations behind the project are outlined in our business plan," Ethan responded evenly. "Urban renewal without displacement. Community investment. Sustainable." "Spare us the mission statement," another investor interrupted. "We've all read the leaked emails." Cobb leaned forward. "Ethan, no one questions the quality of your work. The buildings are improving. The financials are strong. But this revelation raises questions about your decision-making." "I've made every decision in the best interest of the properties and their residents," Ethan insisted. Eleanor slid a document across the table. "Then you won't object to our proposal." Ethan scanned the paper, his stomach sinking. "You want me to step down as CEO?" "Temporarily," Cobb clarified, "while an independent audit confirms all decisions were made ethically and according to best practices." "And if I refuse?" "The consortium withdraws its $47 million investment," Eleanor stated flatly. "The buildings revert to bank ownership under the terms of your loans." Ethan looked around the table, searching for any allies. He found none. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," Eleanor concluded, rising from her seat. "We hope you'll make the right choice for the communities you claim to care about." After they left, Ethan sat alone in the conference room, staring at the document. Stepping down would mean losing control of everything he'd built. But refusing meant losing the buildings entirely, and with them, the homes of hundreds of residents who had finally begun to trust in a better future. His phone buzzed with a message from Jack. Asterisk news keeps getting worse. Richard is talking to every reporter who'll listen. Claiming tenant harassment, personal vendetta, the works. Call me asterisk. Before he could respond, Thomas appeared in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically rattled. We have another problem, the attorney said. The judge granted Richard's request for an injunction against the resident equity program pending review. On what grounds? Conflict of interest. He's arguing that the program is designed to ingratiate yourself with tenants to influence potential witnesses in his lawsuit. Ethan laughed bitterly. So helping residents build equity in their homes is now suspicious because Richard says so? The timing doesn't help, Thomas admitted. Coming right after the email leak, it looks reactive. It's not. I've been planning the equity program for months. I know that. But perception. To hell with perception, Ethan snapped, rising from his chair. The program is sound. The residents deserve ownership stake. I'm not backing down because Richard managed to find a sympathetic judge. Thomas studied him carefully. This isn't just about the buildings anymore, is it? It's about winning. The observation landed like a physical blow. Ethan sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. What happened to the architect who wanted to create homes where people belonged? Thomas asked quietly. The one who designed the nexus because he understood what it meant to never have stability. That architect discovered that nice guys finish last, Ethan replied bitterly. Did he? Because from where I'm standing, that architect won a national grant, secured major investment, and was transforming 7 communities before he got sidetracked by a personal vendetta. Thomas placed another document on the table. The investors aren't the only ones with a proposal. Ethan glanced at the paper. What's this? A settlement offer for Richard's lawsuit. Full release of all claims in exchange for a public apology and reinstatement as building manager of West Park. Absolutely not. It would make the lawsuit go away. It would put a corrupt manager back in charge of vulnerable residents, Ethan countered. Not happening. Thomas nodded, as if Ethan had confirmed something. That's what I thought you'd say. Good. Good. It means you still care about the right things. Thomas gathered his papers. Think about that before you decide on the investor's proposal. After Thomas left, Ethan walked through the quiet office. The team had worked late into the night attempting damage control, and exhaustion hung in the air. Ariadne was still at her desk, surrounded by building plans and financial projections. You should get some rest, Ethan said, pausing at her doorway. She looked up, dark circles beneath her eyes. I'm trying to salvage the equity program. If we restructure it as a tenant association with independent oversight, we might get around the injunction. Why are you working so hard on this? It's my mess. Because I believe in what we're doing, she said simply. The real work, not the revenge part. Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang with an unknown number. Mr. Hunt? This is Patricia from the Urban Innovation Grant Committee. The board has called an emergency meeting regarding your funding status in light of recent revelations. The hits kept coming. By evening, Ethan had fielded calls from concerned lenders, angry city officials, and a dozen reporters seeking comment. The resident assistance offices in all 7 buildings reported tenants panicking about the future of their homes. Exhausted, he drove to West Park after hours, using his key to access the roof once again. The night air was cool against his face as he leaned against the railing, staring out at the city he'd once hoped to transform. Twice in 1 week. People will talk. He turned to find Daisy emerging from the stairwell, wrapped in a cardigan against the evening chill. I'm not in the mood for another confrontation, he said wearily. Neither am I. She joined him at the railing, keeping a careful distance. But I think we need to talk. About what? How I ruined your life by enforcing a legitimate lease. Or how you're helping Richard destroy everything I've built. She looked genuinely surprised. I'm not helping Richard with anything. I withdrew from his lawsuit yesterday. Why? Because I saw what you're really doing here. She gestured toward the building beneath them. This isn't about me or Richard anymore. It's about all these people who finally have a landlord who gives a damn. Ethan studied her skeptically. You expect me to believe you care about that? I know I hurt you, she said quietly. What I did was unforgivable. But I'm not the villain you've made me in your mind, Ethan. The day I walked in on you and Richard, he said carefully, you said I was predictable. Safe. Too buried in my blueprints to notice what was happening right in front of me. I was trying to hurt you, she admitted. Trying to make what I did your fault somehow. They stood in silence for a moment, the city humming below them. Why did you come looking for me tonight? Ethan finally asked. Mrs. Chen told me you might be up here. She's worried about you. They all are. Daisy turned to face him. There's a meeting happening in the community room right now. Residents from all 7 buildings. They're organizing to support you against Richard and the investors. What? They've seen the difference you've made. The repairs, the transparent policies, the equity program. They don't want to lose that. Something tightened in Ethan's chest. It might be too late. The investors want me to step down. So you're just giving up? The man who secretly bought 7 buildings to right a wrong. That man made decisions for the wrong reasons, Ethan said bitterly. And now hundreds of people might lose their homes because of it. Daisy stepped closer. The reasons you started don't matter as much as why you continued. Why you designed the equity program. Why you stood up to Richard at the gala. I continued because... Ethan trailed off, realizing he didn't have a simple answer. Because somewhere along the way, it stopped being about revenge and started being about doing something that mattered, she finished for him. At least, that's what it looks like to everyone else. Before Ethan could respond, the roof access door opened again, and Jack emerged. There you are. I've been calling for hours. He nodded awkwardly to Daisy before turning back to Ethan. You need to come downstairs. Now. What's happening? The residents. They're all here. All 7 buildings sent representatives. Ethan followed Jack and Daisy down to the community room, where nearly 100 people had crowded into the space. Mrs. Chen stood at the front, organizing what appeared to be a petition drive. The room fell silent as Ethan entered. Then Mrs. Chen stepped forward. Mr. Hunt, we've heard about the investors threatening to pull out because of Mr. Gear's accusations. It's complicated, Ethan began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. We don't care why you bought our buildings. We care what you've done since. She held up a stack of papers. These are statements from residents in all 7 properties attesting to the improvements you've made and supporting your continued management. Another resident stepped forward. A young mother Ethan recognized from Parkview Apartments. When the water main broke, you made sure every displaced family had a hotel room. The old owners would have left us on the street. You fixed my grandmother's heat after 15 years of complaining to the previous management, another added. You listen when we speak, Mrs. Chen concluded. That is what matters to us. Ethan stood speechless as resident after resident voiced support, sharing stories of improvements large and small. People whose names he'd never known spoke of him with respect, even affection. We're taking these statements to the investors tomorrow morning, Jack explained quietly. And to the media. 100 residents speaking out should counter whatever Richard is saying. For the first time in days, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Not for his position or his company, but for the work itself, the communities he'd helped strengthen, the people whose lives had improved. Thank you, he said when the testimonials finally ended. All of you. But there's something you should know. The room quieted as Ethan stepped to the center. The investors aren't wrong to question my judgment. I did buy these buildings partly out of a desire for justice. He glanced briefly at Daisy. I wanted to prove something, to show I wasn't powerless. He looked around the room at the faces watching him intently. But somewhere along the way, I remembered why I became an architect in the first place. To create spaces where people belong, where communities can thrive. His voice strengthened. That's what matters. Not who owns the buildings, but how they're run. Not who has power, but how that power is used. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. So you'll fight to keep control? Ethan took a deep breath. No, I'm going to do something better. He turned to Jack. Call Thomas. Tell him to draw up paperwork accelerating the resident equity program. I'm transferring controlling interest in all 7 properties to tenant associations, effective immediately. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. But the injunction, Jack began, doesn't apply if I'm not involved, Ethan finished. The residents will control their own buildings. Nexus Development will serve as property manager only, with contracts renewable annually by resident vote. Can you do that? Someone called out. What about the investors? The buildings are profitable now. The loans can be restructured. Ethan smiled slightly. Besides, it's exactly what I proposed in my grant application: innovative community housing models. Just more innovative than I originally planned. As the meeting dissolved into excited conversation, Ethan slipped out of the crowded room. He needed air, needed to think through the implications of what he'd just committed to. In the lobby, Daisy caught up to him. "You're really giving away control? After everything you did to get it?" "I'm putting control where it belongs," he corrected. "With the people who live here." She studied him with new eyes. "The Ethan I knew 3 months ago couldn't have done this." "The Ethan you knew 3 months ago was afraid of losing what little he had," he replied. "I'm not afraid anymore." As he stepped outside into the cool night, Ethan felt lighter than he had in months. Whatever happened tomorrow with the investors, with Richard's lawsuit, with his career, he had finally made a decision for the right reasons. But the fight was far from over. The next morning dawned bright and clear, at odds with the storm Ethan faced. By 8 a.m., he sat in Thomas's office, signing the complex documents that would transfer controlling interest in all 7 properties to newly formed tenant associations. "This is the most expensive temper tantrum I've ever facilitated," Thomas remarked, sliding another document across the desk for signature. "It's not a tantrum," Ethan replied, signing his name. "It's the right thing to do." "It's both," Thomas countered. "And it's legally sound, which is what matters to me." The Urban Innovation Grant specifically encouraged innovative ownership models, and the investor agreements don't prohibit restructuring. They expected me to maintain control. They expected returns on investment, Thomas corrected, which they'll still receive. The buildings remain profitable whether you're the sole owner or the management partner to tenant associations. Jack burst in, waving his phone. "You need to see this." He pulled up a news site where the headline blazed: "Tenants rally behind embattled developer, claim ex-manager exploited residents." The article featured quotes from dozens of residents praising Ethan's management and condemning Richard's practices. Mrs. Chen's stern face appeared in a prominent photograph captioned, "He listens when we speak." "That's what matters." "It's trending locally," Jack said, scrolling through social media responses. "The narrative is shifting. People are questioning Richard's motives." Thomas looked impressed. "This should help with the investors." "Speaking of which," Ethan glanced at his watch, "that meeting starts in 30 minutes. "About that," Jack said, his expression turning serious. "There's been a development. Richard has called a press conference at the same time as your investor meeting. He's promising explosive new revelations about you and Nexus." Ethan absorbed this calmly. "Let him talk. The facts speak for themselves." "There's more," Jack continued. "Daisy called me this morning. She wants to meet with you before both events. Says it's urgent." Ethan hesitated. What could she possibly have to say now? "She wouldn't tell me," Jack replied. But she seemed frightened. 20 minutes later, Ethan sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from Nexus headquarters. Daisy slid into the seat across from him, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice low. "I didn't know who else to go to." "What's going on?" She pulled out her phone, opening a voice recording app. "I need you to listen to something." She pressed play, and Richard's voice filled the space between them. Asterisk, the fabricated emails were just the beginning. "By the time I'm done, Hunt will be lucky to design doghouses, let alone apartment buildings. The investors will run screaming." Asterisk. A second voice, unfamiliar to Ethan, responded. Asterisk, "You're sure these building code violations will stick?" Asterisk. "They'll stick because we're creating them," Richard laughed. Asterisk, "The inspector owes me. 1 failed electrical system, 1 accusation of falsified safety reports, and Nexus development is done. Even better, Hunt might face criminal charges." Asterisk. Asterisk, "Isn't that risky?" Asterisk. Asterisk, "Not if it's contained to 1 building. Small price to pay to get everything back." Asterisk. The recording ended. Ethan stared at Daisy, processing what he'd just heard. "When did you get this?" he asked. "Last night. Richard has been trying to convince me to rejoin his lawsuit. He came to my apartment, already drunk, bragging about his plan." Her hands trembled slightly. "I started recording when I realized what he was saying." "Why are you showing me this?" "Because he's talking about endangering an entire building full of people," she exclaimed. Tampering with electrical systems? That could cause a fire, Ethan. You could have gone to the police. With what proof? A possibly illegal recording and the word of the vindictive ex-girlfriend? She shook her head. They wouldn't take it seriously until after something happened. Ethan checked his watch. The investor meeting started in 10 minutes. Richard's press conference, too. Which building? He asked. He didn't say. But he's holding his press conference at West Park. I think that's where. Ethan was already on his feet, phone to his ear. Jack, where are you? I need you to call Thomas and tell him to delay the investor meeting. Then call the fire marshal and the city building inspector. Tell them there's an imminent safety hazard at West Park Apartments. What's happening? Jack demanded. Richard is sabotaging the electrical system to frame us for code violations. He's planning to announce it at his press conference. Jesus Christ. I'm on it. Ethan looked at Daisy. Thank you for this. You should stay away from West Park today. I'm coming with you, she said firmly, rising from her seat. This isn't your problem anymore. Actually, it is. It's my home, and Richard involved me in his schemes for months. Her chin lifted. It's time I did the right thing, too. They arrived at West Park 15 minutes later to find chaos unfolding. News vans lined the street where Richard had set up for his press conference. Inside the lobby, residents milled about in confusion as fire marshals and building inspectors streamed toward the basement. Mr. Hunt. Mrs. Chen hurried over. What's happening? They're evacuating the building. Possibly an electrical issue, Ethan explained, keeping his voice calm. Just a precaution. But Mr. Gear is outside telling reporters that you've been neglecting maintenance. That people could have been hurt. I know. We're handling it. Ethan spotted Thomas pushing through the crowd toward them. The investors are livid, the attorney reported. They think this is a publicity stunt to avoid their meeting. It's not a stunt, Daisy interjected. Richard sabotaged the electrical system to frame Ethan. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. Do you have proof? She played the recording for him. Thomas's expression darkened with each word. This changes everything, he said when it finished. We need to get this to the authorities immediately. Already in progress, Ethan replied. Jack's working with the fire marshal now. Outside, Richard's press conference was gaining momentum. Through the glass doors, Ethan could see him gesturing dramatically, surrounded by reporters and cameras. He's telling them the building is unsafe, Thomas reported after stepping outside briefly. Claiming you ignored maintenance warnings that could have endangered residents. A commotion from the basement stairwell drew their attention. 2 fire marshals emerged, escorting a maintenance worker in handcuffs. Jack followed behind them, grim-faced. They found him tampering with the electrical panel, Jack explained, reaching them. He confessed immediately, said Richard paid him $5,000 to create a small, contained problem that would trigger code violations. Is the building actually in danger? Ethan asked. Not anymore. They've secured the system. Jack lowered his voice. But if they hadn't caught it, he had rigged a short that could have caused a serious fire. Ethan's blood ran cold. People could have died. Exactly, Jack confirmed. The fire marshal wants to speak with you, but first, he gestured toward the front doors. I think Richard's press conference is about to take an unexpected turn. Outside, Richard was in full performance mode, his voice carrying through the open doors. And I have documentation proving that Ethan Hunt not only purchased these buildings under false pretenses, but has systematically ignored safety concerns that could have resulted in tragedy. The fire marshal, a stern woman in uniform, emerged from the building and strode directly toward the press conference, followed by police officers. Richard faltered mid-sentence as they approached. Richard Gere? The marshal said loudly enough for the microphones to catch. You're wanted for questioning in connection with the deliberate sabotage of this building's electrical system and conspiracy to commit arson. The reporters erupted in questions as the police moved in. Richard's face drained of color. This is ridiculous. I'm exposing Hunt's negligence, he protested. We have a confession from your accomplice and evidence of payment, the marshal replied calmly. Please come with us. As the police led a sputtering Richard away, reporters swarmed toward Ethan, who had emerged from the building with Thomas, Jack, and Daisy. Mr. Hunt, did you know about the sabotage attempt? Is this connected to the lawsuit Mr. Gear filed against you? Are residents in danger? Thomas stepped forward smoothly. Nexus Development received information this morning about a potential threat to this building. We immediately contacted authorities, who found evidence of deliberate tampering with safety systems. Thanks to swift action by the fire marshal and building inspectors, at no point were residents in actual danger. While Thomas handled the press, Ethan turned his attention to the gathered residents, who watched with expressions ranging from shock to anger. Everyone will be allowed back inside once the fire marshal gives final clearance, he assured them. In the meantime, we've arranged for the community center next door to provide temporary shelter and refreshments. Mrs. Chin approached, shaking her head in disbelief. He was willing to endanger all of us just to get back at you? It appears so, Ethan replied grimly. Then we are fortunate you are our landlord instead of him, she said firmly. Actually, Ethan smiled slightly, as of this morning, you are your own landlords. The paperwork transferring controlling interest to the tenant associations has been filed. Her eyes widened. You really did it? I really did. As residents dispersed toward the community center, Ethan noticed Dominic Cobb standing at the edge of the chaos, observing everything with keen interest. Beside him stood Eleanor Rigby and two other investors. I believe your investor meeting has come to you, Jack murmured, nodding in their direction. Ethan walked over to meet them, bracing for the worst. Not exactly how I planned to start our discussion, he admitted. Cobb surprised him with a thin smile. Actually, I think this has been quite illuminating. You've had an eventful morning, Eleanor observed. Transferring ownership to tenant associations, thwarting sabotage, avoiding a potential disaster. How did you know about the ownership transfer? Thomas called to explain why you'd be late, Cobb replied. Interesting strategy, giving away what you fought so hard to control. It wasn't a strategy, Ethan said truthfully. It was the right thing to do. The investors exchanged glances. We came here ready to demand your resignation, Eleanor said bluntly. Now I'm not so certain that would be in our best interest. The tenant associations will still need management, another investor pointed out. Someone who understands the properties and has earned the residents' trust. Ethan looked between them, hardly daring to hope. You're not pulling your investment? Let's just say we're open to hearing your new proposal, Cobb replied. Particularly since your tenant-centered approach seems to be generating rather impressive community support. He nodded toward the street, where residents were speaking passionately to reporters, defending Nexus Development and condemning Richard's actions. The resident equity model is actually more financially stable long-term, Ethan explained, seizing the opening. Tenant owners have skin in the game. They care for properties better, stay longer, and create more stable communities. Which translates to lower maintenance costs and higher property values, Eleanor mused. Exactly. Your returns remain secure, possibly even improve, while the social impact increases exponentially. Cobb studied him thoughtfully. You've changed, Hunt. 3 months ago, you were talking about profit margins and design innovations. Now you sound like a community organizer. I've learned that the best designs mean nothing if they don't serve the people who live in them, Ethan replied. Well, Eleanor said after a moment, I believe we have a modified agreement to discuss. Shall we reschedule for tomorrow, assuming this situation is resolved? Thank you, Ethan said sincerely. I won't let you down. As the investors departed, Jack clapped him on the shoulder. That went better than expected. Much better, Ethan agreed, watching as the fire marshal emerged to announce the all-clear for residents to return. As people began filing back into the building, Ethan noticed Daisy standing apart from the crowd, watching him. He walked over to her. Thank you, he said simply. If you hadn't recorded that conversation, hadn't warned me. I had a lot to make up for, she replied quietly. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before she spoke again. So what happens now? With the buildings? With your company? The tenant associations take control. Nexus provides management and implements the renovation plans, with resident approval for all major changes. He shrugged. It's actually closer to my original vision than I realized. And us? She asked hesitantly. I know you hate me. I don't hate you, Ethan interrupted, surprising himself with the truth of it. I was angry, hurt, but somewhere along the way, that stopped being what drove me. What drives you now? He gestured toward the residents returning to their building. Elderly couples helping each other up the steps, young families with children in tow, students carrying backpacks. Creating places where people belong, where they have security and community. He smiled slightly. What I always wanted to do before I got sidetracked. Daisy studied him with new eyes. You know, when we were together, I always thought you were holding something back. Some part of yourself you never shared. I was, he admitted. I didn't trust that anyone would value the real me, the foster kid with big dreams and deep insecurities. So I became what I thought people wanted, reliable, steady, safe. And now I know that the things I thought were weaknesses, my history, my sensitivity to displacement, my desire for community, are actually my greatest strengths as an architect and a leader. Mrs. Chin approached them, interrupting the moment. Mr. Hunt, the tenant representatives would like to speak with you about forming an interim board while the associations are organized. Do you have time now? Of course, Ethan replied. He turned back to Daisy. Excuse me. Go, she said with a genuine smile. They need you. As Ethan walked away with Mrs. Chun, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The buildings would continue to improve. The residents would have security and ownership. The work would go on, and he would finally be the architect and the man he was always meant to be. 3 weeks after Richard's arrest, Ethan stood before the Urban Innovation Grant Committee in the same room where his journey had begun. Dominic Cobb sat at the center of the panel, his expression unreadable as Ethan concluded his presentation. So as you can see, Ethan said, gesturing to the slides showing the transformed tenant ownership model, the original grant objectives have not only been met but expanded. The Nexus initiative now includes 7 properties where residents have controlling interest through equity shares. A committee member leaned forward. And Nexus Development's role in this new structure? We provide professional property management, renovation oversight, and financial guidance, Ethan explained. But all major decisions require approval from the tenant boards. It's a partnership, not a hierarchy. Quite a departure from conventional development, another member commented. That was the point of the innovation grant, wasn't it? Ethan countered. To find new models for urban housing that serve communities better than the status quo. Cobb removed his glasses. The question before this committee isn't whether your model is innovative, Mr. Hunt. It clearly is. The question is whether your judgment can be trusted given recent events. The room fell silent. This was the moment Ethan had been dreading, the potential loss of the grant that had started everything. My judgment was flawed at the beginning, Ethan admitted. I allowed personal feelings to influence a business decision. But the work itself has always been sound. The buildings are improving. Residents have security and agency they never had before. He straightened his shoulders. Judge me by the results, not by how I stumbled toward them. After being dismissed, Ethan paced the hallway outside the committee room. Jack and Ariadne waited nearby, both tense with anticipation. They have to see what we've accomplished, Ariadne insisted. The resident equity program is being written up in urban planning journals already. Academic interest doesn't always translate to institutional support, Jack cautioned. The committee room door opened, and Cobb's assistant emerged. Mr. Hunt, they're ready for you. Inside, the committee members sat in the same formal arrangement, their expressions neutral. Mr. Hunt, Cobb began, this committee has reviewed your revised implementation of the Urban Innovation Grant, the events surrounding the purchase of the Westridge properties, and the subsequent restructuring of ownership. Ethan held his breath. We have decided, Cobb continued, to not only maintain your current funding, but to extend the grant for an additional 2 years to fully evaluate the tenant equity model's long-term sustainability. Relief washed over Ethan. Thank you. I'm not finished, Cobb interrupted. The extension comes with conditions. First, you will work with an independent ethics advisor appointed by this committee. Second, Nexus Development will document every aspect of the model for potential replication in other communities. And third, he leaned forward, you will personally teach a seminar series at the Urban Design Institute on community-centered development. Ethan blinked in surprise. You want me to teach? Your journey from conventional architect to community advocate offers valuable lessons, Cobb replied with the ghost of a smile. Both what to do and what not to do. Outside, Ethan shared the news with Jack and Ariadne, who celebrated with relieved laughter. So not only did they not cancel the grant, they extended it? Jack marveled. You have the devil's own luck, Hunt. Not luck, Ariadne corrected. Results. The model works. The residents are thriving. Even the most skeptical committee member can see that. As they walked toward their office, Ethan's phone rang Thomas. The DA has filed formal charges against Richard, the attorney reported. Criminal damage to property, conspiracy to commit arson, and wire fraud related to his management practices. They're offering him a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Stellar Property Group's larger operations. Will he take it? His new attorney is strongly recommending it. Otherwise, he's looking at 8 to 10 years. After hanging up, Ethan shared the update with Jack and Ariadne. So Richard goes down and potentially takes the corrupt property group with him, Jack summarized. Poetic justice. Justice, Ethan agreed, but not revenge. Not anymore. That evening, Ethan visited West Park to attend the first official meeting of its tenant association board. The newly elected 7-member board included Mrs. Chun as chairperson and representatives from diverse resident groups. The community room buzzed with energy as residents filled every seat. When Ethan entered, conversations paused briefly before resuming with increased enthusiasm. He found a spot at the back, content to observe. Mrs. Chun called the meeting to order. Welcome to the inaugural session of the West Park Tenant Association. As our first order of business, we'll review the renovation priorities survey results. For the next hour, Ethan watched democracy in action as residents debated playground improvements versus lobby renovations, security enhancements versus garden spaces. The discussions were passionate but respectful, with board members carefully ensuring all voices were heard. When they eventually turned to financial matters, Mrs. Chun called Ethan forward. Mr. Hunt has prepared a financial overview of our current position and renovation budget. Standing before the residents, many of whom he now knew by name, Ethan felt a profound shift in his relationship to this building and its people. He was no longer their landlord or their savior, but their partner. As you can see from these projections, he explained, displaying simplified financial charts, the building's operating costs are now transparent and fully accounted for. Every dollar of rent is tracked, with allocations for maintenance, improvements, emergencies, and reserves. A resident raised her hand. How does this compare to before? Under the old management, under Stellar's ownership, approximately 38% of rent revenue was extracted as profit, Ethan replied. Now, that same percentage goes into the resident equity fund and capital improvements. Murmurs of appreciation spread through the room. As the meeting concluded, Ethan was surrounded by residents with questions, suggestions, and, most surprisingly, expressions of gratitude. My daughter can finally sleep through the night without that leaky pipe dripping, one father told him. The new security doors make me feel safe for the first time in years, an elderly resident added. Ethan absorbed their words, humbled by the realization that his work, regardless of how it began, had made tangible improvements in people's daily lives. As the crowd thinned, he noticed Daisy standing near the doorway observing. Their eyes met briefly before she slipped out. Ethan excused himself and followed. He caught up with her in the lobby. Were you at the meeting? I was, she confirmed. It's amazing what you've accomplished. What the residents have accomplished, he corrected. I just created the structure. Don't downplay it. You changed everything, for them and for yourself. She hesitated. I wanted to let you know I'm moving out at the end of the month. Because of me? Because it's time for a fresh start, she explained. I've been offered a teaching position at the Art Institute in Westlake. It's a good opportunity. I'm glad for you, Ethan said, surprised to find he meant it. Before I go, there's something you should know. Daisy took a deep breath. Richard approached me weeks before you caught us. Told me if I helped him manage you, kept you distracted while he dealt with his financial problems, he'd get me a gallery showing through his connections. Ethan stared at her, processing this new information. So it wasn't just an affair. It started as manipulation, she admitted. Richard targeted me because of you. But that doesn't excuse my choices. I could have told you. Should have told you. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know it wasn't about you being too safe or predictable. It was about Richard's corruption extending into every part of this building, including me. She looked away. I've been cooperating with the prosecutor's office. My testimony about Richard's business practices will support their case. Before Ethan could respond, Jack burst through the front doors, his expression urgent. There you are. You need to get to Parkview Apartments right away. What's happened? A fire. Nothing to do with Richard, Jack added quickly, seeing Ethan's alarm. Electrical issue in the old wiring we haven't replaced yet. Everyone's safe, but there's significant damage to the east wing. Are the residents? Emergency response teams are there. The resident board is coordinating temporary housing, but they need you. Ethan turned to Daisy. I have to go. I know, she said with a sad smile. You always did put others first. I just didn't appreciate it until now. As Ethan rushed toward his car, she called after him. For what it's worth, I'm proud of who you've become. The next 12 hours tested everything Ethan and his team had built. The fire at Parkview had damaged 23 units, displacing 37 residents. Throughout the night, Ethan worked alongside the tenant association, emergency services, and his staff to ensure everyone had safe accommodations, essential supplies, and clear information. By dawn, temporary housing had been secured for all affected residents in nearby hotels and vacant units across other Nexus properties. Insurance adjusters were already on site, and renovation teams were assessing the damage. Exhausted, Ethan sat in the Parkview lobby as the sun rose, reviewing the incident response with the resident board president, Marcus Whitaker. Your emergency protocols worked perfectly, Marcus acknowledged. 10 hours ago, these folks thought they'd lost everything. Now they know exactly when they can go home and who's covering the costs. That's the advantage of the association model, Ethan replied. When residents have ownership stake, everyone responds faster, cooperates better. And it helps to have a management partner who shows up at midnight and stays until dawn, Marcus added with a knowing smile. As their meeting concluded, Ariadne arrived with architectural plans already in progress. I've been thinking, she said, spreading drawings across the table. We can turn this crisis into an opportunity. The damaged section needed renovation anyway. With the insurance coverage, we can implement the improved floor plans we've been discussing. More natural light, better flow between spaces. Ethan studied the designs with growing enthusiasm. This could actually make those units better than before. Exactly. Sometimes destruction creates space for something new to emerge. She gave him a meaningful look. Isn't that what this whole journey has been about? Later that day, as Ethan finally returned to his office after 30 sleepless hours, he found Jack waiting with unexpected news. The story of how the tenant associations responded to the fire has gone viral, his friend reported, showing him social media posts and news articles. People are calling it a new model for disaster response in urban housing. All we did was follow the emergency protocols we developed with the residents, Ethan said, too tired to fully process the information. That's the point. No one expects landlords and tenants to work together like this. Jack handed him a stack of messages. These all came in today. Housing advocates, city planners, even developers, all wanting to learn about the Nexus model. Ethan stared at the messages, the magnitude of what they'd created finally dawning on him. What had begun as a personal vendetta had evolved into something that could potentially transform urban housing across the city, maybe even beyond. We need to document everything, he decided. The governance structure, the equity model, the emergency protocols, all of it. Make it open source so other communities can adapt it. Already on it, Jack confirmed. Thomas is drafting template legal documents for tenant associations. Ariadne is creating design guidelines for community-centered renovations. And the investors? Ecstatic. The publicity from the fire response has attracted new funding offers. Eleanor called it the best crisis management she's ever witnessed. As Jack continued updating him, Ethan gazed out his office window toward the city skyline. 6 months ago, he had been a broken man, seeking revenge against those who had humiliated him. Now he stood at the center of a movement that could change thousands of lives for the better. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Hunt? The tenant board presidents are here for the emergency response review. Send them in, he replied, straightening despite his exhaustion. Mrs. Chun led the group of 7 board presidents into his office, their faces showing varying degrees of concern and determination. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Ethan began. "The response at Parkview demonstrated both our strengths and areas for improvement." "That's not why we asked for this meeting," Mrs. Chun interrupted gently. "We've been discussing something important among the associations." She placed a document on his desk, a formal contract with Nexus Development letterhead. "What's this?" Ethan asked. "A partnership agreement," she explained, "between all 7 tenant associations and Nexus Development. We want to formalize our relationship on a permanent basis, with you as our exclusive management partner." Ethan scanned the document in surprise. "This is a 10-year agreement, with options for renewal," Marcus added. "We know what we have is special. We want to ensure it continues, regardless of what offers you might receive from other developments." "You're locking me in?" Ethan asked, bemused. "We're securing our future," Mrs. Chun corrected. "And yours." As the board presidents outlined their vision for the long-term partnership, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. A sense of belonging, of being valued not for what he could provide, but for who he was and what they could build together. In that moment, surrounded by people who had once been strangers, then tenants, and now partners, Ethan Hunt finally understood that the buildings he had purchased for revenge had given him something far more valuable than power or vindication. They had given him a home. 1 year later, Ethan stood on the rooftop garden of West Park Apartments, surrounded by the flourishing vegetation that residents had planted and tended. What had once been a barren tar roof was now a vibrant community space with raised garden beds, comfortable seating areas, and spectacular views of the city. "Hard to believe this was your brooding spot a year ago," Jack commented, joining him at the railing. "Now it's the crown jewel of the Nexus properties." "The residents did this," Ethan reminded him. "I just approved the budget." Always deflecting credit. Jack shook his head with a smile. "You've gotten better at that than taking it." Below them, preparations for the 2nd annual community gala were underway in the courtyard. Unlike the previous year's formal affair, this celebration was resident-designed, a festival atmosphere with food vendors from the neighborhood, local musicians, children's activities, and information booths about the tenant equity program. "Quite different from last year," Ethan observed. "Better," Jack replied. "Less about impressing investors, more about actual community." Thomas joined them, tablet in hand. "The final numbers from the audit are in. The tenant equity program has increased property values by 22% across all 7 buildings while maintaining affordability for existing residents." "And the retention rate?" Ethan asked. 93%, Thomas confirmed, compared to the citywide average of 67%. "Turns out when people have ownership stake, they tend to stay." "What about new applications?" "Waiting lists for all properties," Thomas reported. "We've had to implement a lottery system for openings, with priority for displaced residents from other neighborhoods." Ethan nodded, satisfied. The model was working even better than he had hoped. Residents had security and growing equity. The properties were thriving financially. The negative publicity from the previous year had long since been replaced by glowing case studies in urban planning journals. "Oh, and Richard's sentencing is next week," Thomas added. His testimony against Stellar Property Group led to indictments against 3 executives. The DA is recommending a reduced sentence of 3 years plus restitution to former tenants. "Will you attend?" Jack asked. Ethan shook his head. "That chapter's closed for me." Ariadne appeared at the rooftop entrance, elegant in a summer dress. "They're ready for you downstairs. The mayor has arrived, and the resident board presidents want to make their announcement." As they descended to the courtyard, Ethan was struck by the transformation. Colorful banners hung between buildings. Children played in a new playground area. Elderly residents chatted in comfortable seating clusters. Music filled the air as a local jazz quartet performed on a small stage. Mrs. Chun intercepted them at the bottom of the stairs. "There you are. Everyone's waiting." She led Ethan toward a gathering at the center of the courtyard, where the 7 board presidents stood with the mayor and representatives from the Urban Innovation Grant Committee, including Dominic Cobb. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began as Ethan joined the group, I'm delighted to be here celebrating the one-year anniversary of what has become a model for urban housing renewal across our city. He gestured toward display boards, showing before and after images of the properties. The Nexus initiative has demonstrated that development can occur without displacement, that profit and community well-being are not mutually exclusive, and that resident ownership creates sustainable neighborhoods. Mrs. Chun stepped forward, which is why the 7 tenant associations of the Westridge properties are proud to announce the creation of the Nexus Community Development Fund. She unveiled a large check made out to Nexus Development for $5 million. This fund, she continued, represents the combined first-year profits from all 7 properties, reinvested to expand the tenant equity model to other buildings in need of transformation. Ethan stared at the check in shock. I don't understand. Marcus Whitaker explained. We voted to allocate our profit shares toward expansion rather than individual distribution. The returns will still flow to resident owners, but we're investing in growth first. You're funding new acquisitions? Ethan asked, struggling to process the implications. With you as our development partner, Mrs. Chin confirmed. $5 million isn't enough to buy buildings outright, but it's enough to leverage financing for 2 more properties. We've identified target buildings in the Eastbrook district, another board president added. Same owner as before, Stellar Property Group. Same issues with deferred maintenance and tenant exploitation. But this time, Mrs. Chin said with quiet pride, residents from our buildings will mentor the new tenant associations. We'll share what we've learned about governance, finance, and community building. Dominic Cobb stepped forward. The Urban Innovation Committee is matching the residents' investment with an additional $5 million. Your seminar series at the Institute has convinced the board that this model deserves wider implementation. The mayor smiled broadly. And the city's new community housing initiative will expedite permits and provide tax incentives for properties following the Nexus model. Ethan looked from face to face, overwhelmed by what they had collectively created. I don't know what to say. Say you'll continue as our partner, Mrs. Chin replied simply. We have more work to do. As Ethan accepted the ceremonial check to enthusiastic applause, he caught sight of a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd. Daisy, watching the proceedings with a gentle smile. Their eyes met briefly before she turned and disappeared into the gathering. Later, as residents and guests enjoyed food and music, Ethan found himself drawn to the tenant information booth where current residents explained the equity program to interested visitors. He stood at a distance, listening as Mrs. Chin patiently answered questions. Isn't it risky to give tenants so much control? Someone asked. More risky than leaving our homes in the hands of distant investors who never set foot in our buildings? Mrs. Chin countered. We live here. We notice problems before they become disasters. We care for our community because it is ours. But what happens if you want to sell your share and move? Our equity grows with the building's value, she explained. When we sell our shares, we take that equity with us, like homeowners, but without the burden of individual mortgages. Meanwhile, new residents can buy in at affordable entry rates. It sounds too good to be true, the visitor persisted. Mrs. Chin smiled. It wasn't always good. We had to fight for this model. But the truth is, it works because it balances what residents need: security, affordability, community, with what investors want: stable returns, appreciation, and social impact. As the evening progressed, Ethan circulated through the celebration, speaking with residents, officials, and visitors interested in the Nexus model. Everywhere he turned, he witnessed the community he had helped create. Neighbors who knew each other's names, children playing safely, elderly residents engaged and valued. There you are. Ethan turned to find Daisy standing beside him, looking elegant and composed, different from the woman he had once thought he knew. I didn't expect to see you here, he said. I was invited, she replied. The art program I started at Westlake is collaborating with the tenant associations on public installations for the buildings. Mrs. Chin thought I should see the gala. Art program. For at-risk youth, she explained. Turns out I'm better at teaching than producing. I found my calling helping young artists develop their voices. That's wonderful, Ethan said sincerely. What about you? She asked. Have you found what you were looking for? Ethan considered the question, looking out over the vibrant community celebration. I wasn't looking for this, he admitted. But yes, I've found something better than what I thought I wanted. They stood in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared history somehow lighter in the context of who they had each become. I heard about Richard's plea deal, she said finally. I testified last month. That couldn't have been easy. Easier than continuing to avoid responsibility. She met his gaze directly. Something I learned from watching you this past year. A small girl ran up to Ethan, tugging at his jacket. Mr. Hunt, we need you for the ribbon cutting at the new playground. Duty calls, he said to Daisy with a smile. It was good to see you. You too, Ethan. She touched his arm briefly. I'm proud of what you've built here. What you've become. As he walked away, Ethan felt a sense of closure. Not the vindictive satisfaction he had once craved, but something calmer and more complete. The past no longer had power over him. At the playground, children gathered impatiently around a ribbon stretched across the entrance to a state-of-the-art play structure. The equipment had been designed with input from the children themselves, resulting in unique features that reflected the community's diversity. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Chin announced as Ethan arrived, this playground represents the first major capital improvement funded entirely through the Tenant Equity Program. She handed child-sized scissors to a young girl. Sophia, as the youngest member of our resident committee, would you do the honors? The crowd counted down from 3, and Sophia cut the ribbon to cheers and applause. Children streamed onto the playground equipment as parents watched proudly. Ethan stood with Mrs. Chun, observing the joyful scene. When you first bought this building, she said quietly, many of us feared you would be just another landlord making promises you wouldn't keep. I know, Ethan acknowledged. We were wrong, she continued. You gave us more than repairs and renovations. You gave us dignity, agency, the chance to build something lasting. You did the building, Ethan replied. I just created the framework. Sometimes the framework is everything, she said wisely. It determines what can grow and how strong it will stand. As evening deepened into night, the celebration continued with dancing under string lights in the courtyard. Ethan found himself surrounded by the team that had made everything possible: Jack, Thomas, Ariadne, and the dedicated staff of Nexus Development. To think this all started with you getting cheated on, Jack mused, keeping his voice low. Talk about turning lemons into lemonade. More like turning revenge into renewal, Ariadne suggested. Thomas raised his glass. To Nexus Development's second year, may it be less dramatic than the first. They clinked glasses, laughing together as the music played and residents danced nearby. Later, as the celebration wound down and families began returning to their apartments, Ethan found himself drawn once more to the rooftop garden. The night air was cool against his face as he looked out over the city, lights twinkling in the darkness. I thought I might find you up here, Jack said, joining him. Old habits die hard. Not brooding this time, Ethan assured him. Just appreciating. Hard to believe where we were a year ago, Jack observed. You were hell-bent on revenge. The buildings were falling apart. Now look at all this. It's better than anything I could have planned, Ethan admitted. Because it wasn't just your plan in the end, Jack pointed out. That was the key, letting go of control, trusting the community to know what it needed. Ethan nodded, remembering his initial motivations and how they had transformed. When I bought these buildings, I thought power meant control. Now I know it's really about creating possibilities for others. So philosophical, Jack teased. The Urban Design Institute is rubbing off on you. How are the seminars going? Better than expected. We've got architects, developers, city planners, all interested in the model. Ethan smiled. Turns out there's a hunger for development approaches that don't destroy communities. And personally, Jack asked more seriously. Seeing Daisy tonight, are you okay with how things turned out? Ethan considered the question. A year ago, I wanted her to see what she'd thrown away, to regret losing me. Now, I'm just glad we've both found better versions of ourselves, even if it's not together. Very mature, Jack approved. Almost suspiciously so. Don't worry, Ethan laughed. I'm still a work in progress in plenty of other ways. Below them, the last of the celebration was being cleaned up by volunteers. Residents chatted as they stacked chairs and collected decorations, the sense of shared ownership evident in how they cared for the space. So what's next? Jack asked. New buildings? More seminars? World domination through ethical property management. One step at a time, Ethan replied. First, we make the Eastbrook acquisitions work. Prove the model can be replicated. Then we document everything so others can adapt it to their communities. Always the architect, Jack observed. Building systems, not just structures. That's what architecture should be, Ethan said with quiet conviction. Not just designing buildings, but creating frameworks where people can build meaningful lives. As they turned to leave the rooftop, Ethan took one last look at the city stretching before him. Somewhere out there were more buildings in need of transformation, more communities seeking stability, more opportunities to create spaces where people truly belonged. His revenge had become his redemption. His greatest humiliation had led to his most meaningful work. And the power he had once sought over others had transformed into something far more valuable, the power to empower. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, expanding the model to new properties, mentoring emerging tenant associations, navigating the complexities of urban development. But tonight, Ethan Hunt, once a scorned lover seeking vengeance, now a community builder creating change, felt something he had searched for his entire life. He felt home. Hey, beautiful people. What an incredible journey we've been on together, right? I hope you enjoyed Ethan's story of transformation from revenge to redemption. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. And if you connected with this story of finding purpose beyond pain, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss my next upload. I love creating these meaningful stories for you all. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.